In the mid-1960s, the Chevrolet Corvair became one of the most reviled cars in the United States of America. The automotive press loved the zippy little rear engine machine for its crisp handling and its racy feel, but it didn't take long for the machine to become the center of hundreds of lawsuits, alleging that the car was not only responsible for injuring and killing the drivers and passengers, but that General Motors had known it would happen all along. It was a huge allegation, one that at best would cost GM millions of dollars and at worst could kill the company. But the folks at Chevy's research and development department were adamant that they had created a great, well-tested, and safe product, and they decided that the only way to prove it would be to fight back. The only way to fight back would be to gather as much data as possible about how cars handled, and the only way to gather that data would be to hire the best minds in motorsport, the engineers and drivers who knew more about performance than anyone else, to undertake a comprehensive but secret program of testing. And General Motors decided that the best folks for the job would be the tiny Midland-based Chaparral race team headed by automotive legend Jim Hall. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Founded in 1962, Chaparral Cars was perhaps one of the most influential race teams in the history of American motorsport. It all started with two men named Dick Trautman and Tom Barnes, men who are worthy of an episode all on their own. Trautman and Barnes met in 1949 in Frank Curtis's race shop. At that time, Curtis was the preeminent race car builder in America, with his Curtis Craft machines taking 5 Indy 500 victories in the 1950s. Within a few years of its debut, the Curtis Craft was the bulk of the open-wheel racing fields in all of America. Trautman and Barnes got their careers started working for Frank Curtis, but they got along so well and worked so well together that in 1954, they designed their own car, the Trautman-Barnes Special. The car didn't exactly break a ton of ground in terms of experimental design, but it was exceptional in its craft. It was as reliable as it was beautifully made, and it became a winner almost right out of the gate. When British-American entrepreneur Lance Reventlow wanted someone to build his Scarab sports cars, he recruited Trautman and Barnes to do so. By the late 1950s, the Scarabs were winning big sports car races en route to the SCCA National Championship. But the two men still kept tinkering in their own time, and they came up with a car that Trautman told the Los Angeles Times could compete with the imports that dominated the racing scene at the time. This machine was termed the Riverside Racer, and it featured a front-mounted Chevrolet engine and an ultra-light chassis. It had potential, but Trautman and Barnes needed money to actually, produce the damn thing. Enter Jim Hall. A young racer at the time, Hall had come to the realization that if he wanted to progress in his career, he needed to have his own American-built racing cars, because as a customer of European factories, he just wasn't getting anywhere. The Riverside Racer sounded appealing, and Hall was convinced to try it out at the Pacific Grand Prix, one of the biggest U.S. races of the year. In that race, Hall nearly finished second, just behind Sterling Moss in a Lotus 19, until someone knocked him into the hay bales. But between Hall and that Riverside Racer, it was a match made in heaven. In his official autobiography by George Levy, Hall recalled, "From that point on, I realized that I didn't want to buy last year's Lotus. I wanted something that was better. The Scarabs were doing well, and Trautman and Barnes worked there, so I made a deal with Dick Trautman. The deal was for a lightweight and nimble car propelled by an ultra-powerful Chevy engine, and it was a good deal. Cheaper than it would have been to import something from Europe, and much easier to repair. Plus, Trautman and Barnes planned on building 5 of these cars total, and Hall already knew a few guys willing to race them. His first test behind the wheel of one of those machines came on June 5th, 1961, and it turned out that the car needed a lot of work. Hall decided that he would be the one to make that happen. According to Hall, Trautman and Barnes could make a beautiful car but they didn't understand the logic behind why certain pieces needed to be assembled in certain ways. Certainly not the way that Hall did it, with his engineering degree and his keen interest in applying aviation engineering to his race cars. I couldn't say, oh gee, they built it that way, so it must be for a purpose, Hall recalled. I had to say, well, is it right, or do I need to do something? I realized that I needed to do something. He particularly realized he needed to do something when it was clear that the car really, really, really wanted to lift off the ground, just like an airplane. Hall started to transform this car one part at a time, swapping out new parts for old ones and dedicating himself to spending as much time on track as he could. He started reshaping the bodywork to test out different theories he had to counteract lift, and it was at that time that he decided to settle down permanently in Texas. When he voiced his plans to move down south, he was invited to join an investment group that included fellow racers Hap Sharp and Ronnie Hissam. Hap Sharp built his garage across the road from Jim Hall's, and the two men became fast friends, even though Sharp was almost 8 years Hall's senior. Sharp grew up with a father who flew planes and a mother who was a champion hydroplane racer, so he too understood the importance of aerodynamics. Hall and Sharp were almost opposites in terms of personality, with Hall being an introvert and Sharp being the life of the party, but ask them to solve a problem on a race car together, and they would dedicate themselves to finding the answer. At this point, it was early 1962, and Hall and Sharp were racing together in a Troutman Barnes Riverside racer that had been so heavily modified, it warranted its own name, the Chaparral 1. It was also clear that the car was getting seriously outdated. Hall and Sharp had ideas, and they had race shops. So what if they'd never built a car before? They were pretty certain, no matter what, they could figure it out. And figure it out they did. Their first car, the Chaparral 2, began life as a fairly conventional-looking sports car that also started to evolve as Hall and Sharp began to solve problems with lift, the transmission, and so much more. The third iteration of the car, the 2C, was the first Chaparral to feature a rear wing, one that could be adjusted from in the cockpit. The chassis was made of aluminum and therefore lighter, and it set the tone for everything that came next, from a ducted nose to more impressive wings to a fiberglass body. Something that was pulled straight out of boat racing, not automobile racing. Despite the fact that the Chaparral crew consisted of around 20 people designing, building, developing, and testing the cars, the race shop down in Midland, Texas was arguably one of the most fruitful beds of automotive development there ever was. What made Chaparral unique was the fact that so many of its personnel came from backgrounds in various forms of engineering, which meant that when a problem popped up in one of their machines, it was way easier to figure out what happened, come up with a possible solution, than put that solution into action. No idea was too crazy, so long as it could be justified. Chaparral competed in various SCCA and Trans Am championships, but it also contested endurance events abroad and pushed the boundaries in the Canadian American Challenge Cup, or Can-Am, an audacious race series that was founded on the fact that it didn't want to have rules, it just wanted technical innovation. If you're going to pick a race team to help you learn all there is to know about, say, the way a car handles, Chaparral was really your only logical choice. Introduced in 1959 for the 1960 model year, the Chevrolet Corvair was a showstopper. It was the first rear-engine car to be produced in high numbers in the United States, and it almost instantly started making waves. See, the Corvair was different. Yes, it had that rear-engine configuration, but that in and of itself was hugely unique at the time. But it was also the first modern American car to feature swing-axle independent rear suspension, and it proved to be as fun to drive as it was spacious and economical. Plus, it was way cheaper than a lot of Chevy's other models, so that made for an instant appeal. Consumer Reports, Car and Driver, Car Life, and Road Test all pointed out that while early Corvairs did need a little bit of work in the handling department, the second generation introduced by Chevy proved to be a hell of a lot of fun. It was about the closest thing to a race car that you could get for such a cheap price, and it was designed to prove that American automakers could experiment with their technology the same way that the Europeans were doing. All of that quickly fell apart. If you've been around the automotive world, you've inevitably heard of a little book named Unsafe at Any Speed, published by activist Ralph Nader in 1965. In fact, if you've actually ever heard of the Corvair at all, it's probably in connection to this book, which kicks off with a brutal takedown of the car and what Nader describes as its erratic handling. See, not long after the Corvair started hitting highways around America in full force, it also began to be involved in accidents. Strange, single-car accidents that seemed to come from nowhere. The first on record was the accident of Rose Perini, whose Corvair flipped on a California highway in August of 1961. Perini's left arm was severed in the accident, which took place at a road legal speed of 35 miles per hour. Perini hired an attorney, David Harney, to represent her in court, and Harney took a very fascinating perspective here. While most lawsuits against automakers at the time focused on very specific defective parts, Harney was alleging that the whole design of the Corvair was flawed. What's more, he was alleging that General Motors knew that the car was flawed, and that the company nevertheless knowingly sold its cars that could kill or maim drivers in seemingly minor accidents, ones that in another car wouldn't have posed any risk. Harney was seeking around $300,000 for Perini, though they later settled with GM out of court for $70,000, which today is over $700,000. According to Nader in Unsafe at Any Speed, quote, General Motors decided to pay Mrs. Perini rather than continue a trial which for 3 days threatened to expose on the public record one of the greatest acts of industrial irresponsibility in the present century. According to GM, it only decided to pay up because there'd been a miscommunication between Perini and the GM dealership at which she had bought her car, for which they accepted responsibility. Here, Nader presents a lot of evidence to support his assertion that Perini was not at fault. A California Highway Patrol officer named John Bortolazzo, who saw the wreck, said that, quote, all of a sudden the vehicle made a sharp cut to the left and swerved over. During the trial, Bortolazzo claimed that when he inspected the crash scene, he could find nothing to signal driver error or failure of any specific component. He also said that he'd investigated other Corvair crashes, all just as mysterious. His conclusion was that there had to be something inherently wrong with the car to make it flip like this. The Perini Corvair wreck was just the start of what would become a media blitz. On January 13, 1962, the massively popular comedian Ernie Kovacs was killed after losing control of his Corvair station wagon following his wife home from a party. According to the police, Kovacs somehow managed to careen into a power pole. All eyes turned to the car in question, and suddenly, over 100 lawsuits sprang to life, many of them alleging the same claim issued by David Harney, that GM had knowingly designed and sold a defective car. As you can probably imagine, the folks at GM suddenly found themselves with a dilemma. The company's chief legal counsel was a man named Aloysius Power, and Power recommended that GM push these lawsuits to the side as quickly as possible, which meant effectively settling the cases with big money payouts. According to Power, settling the cases would be way more cost-effective than battling the allegations in court. And anyway, who knew what a jury would decide? Who knew what precedent would be set, and how many hundreds of documents GM would have to unearth in the process? Frank Winchell, who was then head of Chevrolet's research and development team, adamantly refused. In Texas legend, Jim Hall and his chaparrals, Winchell's right-hand man, James G. Musser, remembered the argument. Let me read you this quote in full, because I think it's important. Winchell said, "We can't settle because unlike other product liability cases we've had in past years where it was a specific defect on a specific car, the plaintiff was claiming that the Corvair design was defective. The whole damn car. What that meant was that if they could win a case on that, then it would establish a claim that all Corvairs are defective. More importantly, it would be a bad reflection on the engineering organization of GM that they had designed a defective vehicle." Obviously, Winchell had a very strong investment in how GM's cars were perceived since he played a role in bringing them to fruition. He didn't want GM to tacitly admit that it was wrong by settling those suits out of court. Moreover, he firmly believed that the lawsuit was inherently wrong. He refused to allow these suits to effectively label his engineers as murderers, and he refused to do anything that might be construed as admitting that. No, Winchell wanted to fight, and amazingly, his bosses agreed. But it would be no easy task. In order to prove its case, GM would have to unearth all of the design documents it produced for the Corvair, as well as any testing data or correspondence related to the car. More than that, though, GM was going to have to do new tests to put these Corvairs through the ringer itself in order to understand the car's handling in increasingly dangerous situations on all terrains under all conditions. Oh, and it would also have to trial similar cars from the competitors in order to evaluate the Corvair's relative performance compared to other machines you could buy on the market. That in and of itself was no easy task, but GM also wanted this testing to fly under the radar. It wouldn't be able to conduct it at its Michigan test ground. It also theoretically should hire a third party to conduct the testing in order to avoid any allegations of bias or numbers fudging. That third party should have an intimate understanding of vehicle dynamics, particularly at high speeds, and it should have its own trial ground, ideally somewhere with a climate that enabled year-round testing. Those were some very specific and tough criteria to meet, but someone did meet them. Their names were Jim Hall and Hap Sharp, founders of the highly successful Chaparral cars, and they had their own proving ground named Rattlesnake Raceway out in the desolate Snakefield Desert in Midland, Texas. In fact, they were already well into the process of converting their front-engine race cars into rear-engine ones, precisely because they believed the rear-engine car would handle better. They sounded like the perfect guys to take on GM's challenge. Now, to really understand the gravity of GM's decision to recruit the Chaparral crew to kick off its Corvair testing, we need to back up just a little bit. In 1955, a massive crash at the 24 Hours of Le Mans killed over 80 spectators. I talk about that whole event in depth in a DPTJ episode titled 1955 Le Mans Disaster, How Racing's Greatest Tragedy Changed the World. But if you remember, one of the after effects of that incident was that America's big three automakers, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, voluntarily signed an agreement that they would no longer compete in auto racing. They'd come under fire for actively promoting a dangerous high-speed activity after Le Mans 55, and rather than let those wounds fester, American automakers decided they were done. Clearly, racing in America didn't suddenly die after the big three signed their pact in 1957. Instead, automakers kind of just withdrew their formal support of racing as well as their works teams. Drivers could still race cars from Ford, GM, or Chrysler. They just wouldn't be hired directly by the automaker to do so, and the automaker wouldn't have any in-house programs designed to develop race cars. But as the 1960s started to get underway, Ford was changing. One of the new head honchos was a man named Lee Iacocca, and Lee Iacocca was determined to revitalize a dying interest in the automotive world. See, kids were coming of age ready to buy cars, but there was nothing fun or sexy on the market. They didn't associate American automakers with performance, the same way they did with European automakers. But Iacocca was determined to change that. In just a few short years, he introduced the Ford Mustang, and he recommitted the company to motorsport, from NASCAR all the way up to the big leagues at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Racing has always served as a to-the-second test bed for the automotive world. If you want to know how well a new technology can hold up, throw it on the racetrack, and you'll find out real quick whether or not it's worth a damn. If Ford was getting involved in racing again, then it was almost certain the company would end up light years ahead of its competitors in the performance side of things. General Motors wasn't quite ready to completely recommit to motorsport, but Frank Winchell knew that if it didn't maintain at least some ties to the racing community, and with the innovative minds, like those of Jim Hall and Hap Sharp, then they risked becoming irrelevant in the developmental world. It was with all of this in mind that Winchell sent a crew down to Midland to inspect the Chaparral facilities. The only thing he felt the race shop was needing was a skid pad, and if Chaparral would build one, then Winchell and GM would officially rent the facility from the team, as well as allow it to take on the testing. Chaparral agreed, and that was that. Well, almost. GM still needed to sign off on the expense. So on August 15th, Winchell distributed a document titled Chaparral Cars, Hall and Sharp to the company's executives. Among photos of Rattlesnake Raceway, financial statements from both Hall and Sharp, and press clippings of Chaparral's racing success, Winchell praises Hall and Sharp as representing the knowledgeable, open-minded, progressive personnel essential to this undertaking. Sure, Hap Sharp may not have been a formal engineer, but he knew a whole lot about this vehicle dynamics thing that GM had become so interested in. And alongside the engineering mind of Jim Hall, they were match made in heaven. But what were the folks at Chaparral going to get out of this whole arrangement? That should seem fairly obvious, but I'll also lay it out explicitly. First and foremost, GM was offering a lot of money to rent the facilities and to draw on the expertise of the crew at hand. But on top of that, GM would also be showing up with heaps of equipment and vehicles. And they were asking Hall and Sharp to run those cars ragged. They wanted hard data, and lots of it, to wipe out any belief that their Corvair was some inherently dangerous machine. That meant the folks at Chaparral would be engaging in a months-long crash course on vehicle dynamics, getting hands-on experience pushing cars to the limit. And if that wasn't enough, well, all of that GM equipment would just be laying around at the ready when Chaparral was ready to test its own race cars. How's that for a sweet deal? Testing was underway as soon as the skid pad was set up, and what resulted was a frankly incredible partnership between Chaparral and Chevrolet. Yes, Hall and Sharp were effectively defining the world of vehicle dynamics, but they also had opportunities to bring their race cars up to the company's Milford Proving Ground, where some of America's best engineering minds could take a look at, say, a Chaparral getting way too much front-end lift, and then devise some solutions to keep it on the ground. Then, back at Rattlesnake, they'd put the Corvair through its paces and fix up their Chaparrals. In Texas legend, Jim Hall remembered, "We drove those Corvairs in just about every conceivable configuration. Unloaded, fully loaded, different tire pressures. What we found was that if you tried hard enough, you could roll just about any car, whether it was a Corvair or a Ford Falcon." Further, Hall started to work with big-name publications like Car and Driver, where he was feeding this new data to the public. There, he could argue that any rear-wheel drive car inherently benefited from a rearward weight bias, which is the exact opposite point the lawsuits were arguing. By the time the first court case came up on the calendar, Chevrolet was ready to go to battle. The first case took place in San Jose, and the plaintiff was a 39-year-old woman named Doreen F. Collins, who claimed that the 1960 Corvair she was driving suddenly and violently went out of control on a straight stretch of 40-mile-per-hour highway. The result? She crashed head-on with a truck, which killed her fiancé and her 7-year-old daughter, and it injured her 3 sons. What the plaintiff did not want to disclose was the fact that Mrs. Collins was driving on a temporary license with just 4 months of experience behind the wheel. Still, she had a good legal team. Her attorney, the aforementioned David Harney, had pulled together an impressive slate of folks with automotive and racing experience, including 3-time national sports car champion Paul O'Shea and former head of Chevy R&D Maurice Olley. Olley in particular claimed that he warned the design team that the Corvair's swing axle rear suspension was, quote, potentially dangerous. But Chevrolet was not going to back down. Oh no. It had assembled a team that not only included the technical genius of Jim Hall, but the driving prowess of Formula One drivers Juan Manuel Fangio and Sterling Moss. No shade to Paul O'Shea, but those were some of the greatest drivers in the world. Men who had lived through the transition between front-engined and rear-engine race cars, and who intimately understood the benefits of the rearward configuration. And if you know anything about Sterling Moss, you probably know about his formidable wit, which was a significant reason for his success and popularity. That came into full force when Moss was being cross-examined by Harney about the stability of the Corvair and its primary competitor, the Ford Falcon, on the skid pad. Both had demonstrated that at about 0.6 G, they'd begin to lose control. Harney asked Moss, "When you were driving the Falcon and it reached approximately 0.6 G, did it become stable as it went out of the skid pad circle?" Moss, obviously miffed, replied, 0.5, 6, whatever. It was stable to the point that it went off the way it was pointing, if you call that stable, yes. Harney asked, by definition, sir, isn't that stability in an understeering car when it leaves the arc? It becomes stable? To which Moss retorted, sir, it depends, if I may, what you call stable. If you are going to have an accident, whether you go to it stably without veering, this to me is not stability. My idea of stability is when I am in complete control of the car. Once I lose control, up, down, or sideways, the car is not stable in my mind. It is out of control. In Texas Legend, George Levy does a really good job illustrating some of the finer points of how Moss tactfully tore apart the pin on which this whole court case hinged. First, he slid in the 0.56 whatever note, which was designed to point out the fact that the Falcon had lost control at 0.5 G, the Corvair at 0.6 G. He also pointed out that an out-of-control car is out of control. When the case was passed over to the jury on August 11, 1965, it took just 4 hours for the 12 jury members to clear GM of all responsibility. At this point, there were hundreds of court cases against GM regarding the Corvair, with damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars. General Motors knew that it was taking a risk with this court case and that it was going to have to turn up with a whole lot of data to back itself up. It had hired the best of the best to get its head out of water, and with that one case in San Jose, General Motors established a precedent that another court would be hard-pressed to overturn. But as you can imagine, that was not an easy sweep. The next case would be heard in Los Angeles in 1966, and it was a doozy. In Drummond v. General Motors, the 16-year-old stepson of a man named Ralph Drummond was killed driving a 1960 Corvair that the case alleged was designed with defects and faults right through its very core. And the case was not going to go in front of a jury. It was to be decided by a single judge, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Bernard S. Jefferson. It was always going to be a big decisive case, but just before it hit the courtroom, a bombshell dropped. See, Nader had published his book Unsafe at Any Speed in November of 1965, and it was a flop. For all of its fiery prose, it turned out that customers weren't really interested in reading a tome that effectively told them the products they were buying were becoming increasingly complex, and as a result, potentially dangerous. That is, until Nader claimed in March of 1966 that General Motors had sent agents after him. Nader said he'd been followed and harassed, that private investigators had interviewed his family and friends, that he felt unsafe. And to make things even worse, GM admitted it had investigated Nader. Even though the automaker firmly denied that it had, say, dug around for information on Nader's sex life, the mere admission was enough to spark a sales frenzy. No one was interested in buying a book about some guy's thoughts on a dangerous car, but when it was clear that the author had been investigated for daring to speak out against a monolith of American culture, well, I would have bought a copy. This was the atmosphere into which the Drummond v. General Motors case kicked off, and it was a big one. Per George Levy, the trial lasted 16 weeks, during which time the court heard from 41 witnesses and generated nearly 10,000 pages of testimony. Once again, Fangio was present, as was a 26-year-old Chevy R&D engineer named Robert James Eaton. Attorney Harney's ears perked up at the mention of an Eaton. Here was a young kid who could possibly crack under pressure, who had only worked at GM for a few months, and who ostensibly would have no allegiances or deep loyalty to the company. Eaton was only supposed to provide context, but Harney subpoenaed him to testify and held him on the stand for 8.5 days of rigorous questioning. As it turned out, Harney's intel on Eaton wasn't exactly complete. Eaton had gotten into SCCA racing when he moved to Detroit for his new job at GM, and he'd seen firsthand how well the Corvair handled on the track. Eaton never cracked, and it cast a serious pall over the plaintiff's argument that the Corvair was inherently dangerous. also causing a headache for Harney, was something that the Chevy R&D team had dreamed up just for this Los Angeles court case. They grabbed a camera and a Corvair and attempted to recreate the accident exactly as it had been described. And inevitably, nothing happened. Then they'd run the test again, going faster and faster until the car finally went off the road. As it turned out, to crash the way the plaintiff described, the car would have needed to be going a whole lot faster than it had been claimed. It was a tool that worked so well for GM that they employed it in subsequent Corvair cases. It was also critical because it counteracted a similar video provided by the plaintiffs, which showed Paula O'Shea somehow losing control at high speeds. Judge Jefferson decisively ruled in GM's favor. The court believes that the Corvairs went out of control and turned over when Mr. O'Shea was driving only because Mr. O'Shea drove in such a manner that the cars would roll over. The same driving skill required in getting the most out of a car's capability may also be used to take a car out of control and roll it over, Jefferson wrote. He continued, "It is the court's conclusion that the Corvair automobile of the 1960 through 1963 variety is not defectively designed, nor a defective product, that no negligence was involved in the manufacturer's adoption of the Corvair design, that the Corvair matches a standard of safety which does not create any unreasonable risk of harm to an average driver, that the cause of the May 16, 1960 accident and the death of Don Wells Lyford was due solely to the actions of said deceased and not to the design or any handling characteristics of the Corvair automobile." With that, most of the other lawsuits crumbled away. General Motors had defended itself, and it had done so with the help of Jim Hall and Tap Sharp. These celebrations on GM's part were pretty muted. The fact of the matter was that even though it had successfully defended itself in the court of law, it had floundered in the court of public opinion for years, and the court cases brought to light the sheer number of people who were being injured or killed behind the wheel of their cars. So what if those cars weren't intentionally designed to hurt people? They had hurt people. They had killed people. The battle in court may have been over, but another battle was about to kick off in the government and within General Motors as a company. Over at GM, though, life after the Corvair was pretty complex. On the one hand, yes, the company had managed to defend itself, to prove that it hadn't designed a car with the intention of hurting or killing its buyers. On the other hand, nobody cared. Even though Chevrolet tried to launch a second-generation Corvair with a much improved rear suspension, the damage had already been done. People so strongly associated the Corvair name with death and injury that sales plummeted, and GM had no choice but to nix the car from its lineup. The court case also brought to light the fact that even if the Corvair wasn't intentionally poorly designed, a lot of people were still dying behind the wheel. By 1965, before the Corvair cases even started hitting the courtroom, automobile accidents had become the #1 cause of death for Americans under 44 years old. A year later, crash fatalities exceeded 50,000, and those rates stayed high for several years after. And as automobiles became an almost irreplaceable part of American life, well, folks wanted more from their cars. In the aftermath of the Corvair court cases, we saw the passing of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which mandated that all automakers equip their new vehicles with a standard suite of safety equipment. People also got sensitive about racing again, particularly hot rodding on public roads. And it also meant that the bigwigs at GM, who had gotten away with subsidizing a race team for a few years, had to figure out a new tack. "We had to keep everything quiet," James G. Musser recalls in Texas Legend. "Everything we did was charged to a vehicle dynamics program, which started with the Corvair and expanded. It was not in compliance with the corporate directives at that point, so we were always concerned that we would be found out." Heading into 1967, the Chevy R&D program realized it could no longer justify the big money expenditures going on down at the Chaparral facility, but it could justify using a race team to test its big block engines. Racing was familiar with the big block already, But automakers were learning that they could charge passenger car customers a whole lot more money for a big block than for a standard engine. GM offered Chaparral use of its big block engines and a 3-speed torque converter transaxle for its race cars in 1967. Chaparral accepted, but the engines proved to be unreliable. According to Jim Hall, the new big block faced 11 failures in just 6 races and a single car. Plus, with the fountains of GM money having dried up, there wasn't an opportunity to do the same level of testing or to build a bunch of spare cars. In endurance racing, it became very clear that the GM transaxles had a significant design fault. Chevy R&D would have to fix the problem, but because Chevy technically wasn't involved in racing, it had no real reason to test that kind of equipment in rigorous race conditions. Though there were plenty of good reasons for the relationship between Chaparral and GM to sour, it didn't, not right away. And in 1968, when Hall dreamed up his iconic 2J, his first call was to Chevy R&D. If you remember last year, in the episode that I dedicated to the 2J, this car was one of the first to attempt to exploit ground effect, or an aerodynamic force that sucks all the air out from underneath the bottom of the car to create a vacuum. That vacuum creates an insane amount of downforce, which in theory meant that a driver would pretty much never have to lift in a corner. In Jim Hall's mind, the best way to achieve this would be by mounting 2 fans on the rear of the car, which would suck air out from beneath it. When he called up Chevrolet, he was interested in knowing if he had a viable idea or if it was only smart in theory. Thanks to ample testing for the Corvair Vehicle Dynamics program, GM had assembled something called a suspension test vehicle. This was a car that was designed to test a whole lot of different suspension setups with ease, and since it was pretty rudimentary, it was easy to convert it into a rough prototype of the sucker car that Hall had proposed. The folks at Chevy R&D mocked up Hall's plan and found that, in a very rough form, it did work. They were able to generate 1.4 G on the skid pad, which was a mind-boggling number at the time. Encouraged, R&D engineer Don Gates proposed to GM management that they be granted permission to develop an actually fully operational version of this sucker car, and that request, unbelievably, was granted. Even though there were clear racing implications, GM was at least still interested in understanding what increased tire adhesion would look like, and this was a really effective way of pursuing that. However, GM was still in turmoil, and just after the car started to be put together, a new crackdown on racing meant they had to get rid of the prototype, as well as anything that kind of maybe would have resembled a race car. GM dropped it off in Midland, since it was, after all, Hall's idea, but it wasn't much to look at. At that point, the 2J was just a tub and some body pieces. No engine, no wiring, and barely put together. The fans hadn't even been installed. But this prototype would become the basis for the Chaparral 2J, and the 20-man crew down in Midland set to work bringing it up to racing condition. Not long after that, John Z. DeLorean called up Jim Hall to ask if he'd like to officially race a Chevrolet Camaro as a factory team in Trans Am. It was part of a ploy to market the Camaro to an enthusiast audience, and it represented GM's first official factory racing effort in years. Hall agreed, and not long after, DeLorean also got interested in the implications of the prototype that was slowly taking shape as the 2J. In fact, he wanted Hall to pick up the pace. If you listened to our episode last year that focused on the 2J, you'll know that this was the car that effectively ended the Chaparral racing program. When it appeared on the track at the Canadian American Challenge Cup, it was unreliable and prone to failure, but the series realized the writing was on the wall. If it let Hall get away with this, then the other manufacturers and race teams would suddenly fall down a spending hole during a time when sponsorship dollars were drying up, and by the end of the year, ground effect technology had been banned in Can-Am, and Jim Hall quit racing. Add to that the fact that GM had once again soured on racing in hopes of pursuing the kind of efficiency offered by Japanese automakers. Well, that was that. There was no reason for Hall to continue. As far as we were concerned, there really wasn't anywhere for us to go at that point, Hall explained in Texas Legend. We'd just already done what we'd done for the future. That's where I was headed, and we got it all kind of taken away. While it was a heartbreaking end for a race team that had done so much to advance the science and engineering of motorsport, it also served as a period of reflection. Hall, Chaparral, and GM had achieved a hell of a lot during the 8 years it worked together, all kicking off with the Vehicle Dynamics program. But not everyone felt GM's appearance in Midland was actually a wholly good thing. In his book Chevrolet Equals Racing, R&D engineer Paul Van Valkenburg wrote, "Possibly most important is the fact that Chaparral cars didn't need outside help to function. It is conceivable that by not working with Chevrolet, they could have taken a more conventional approach to racing and eventually have won more races." Or as another engineer at the time asked, "Looking back, do you think we did Jim more good than harm, or more harm than good?" It's an interesting question, but perhaps a moot point. Part of the thrill of racing for Jim Hall was the engineering. It felt good to win races by being the fastest guy there, but it felt even better to win a race behind the wheel of a car whose very existence had shattered the boundaries of expectation. A car that would change the world. Hall was doing that before GM arrived, but the might of a massive automaker allowed Chaparral to push its boundaries even further, stretching our imagination of what a car can be to its very limits. Imagine getting carte blanche to do whatever you felt was necessary to improve your craft, and the world in which that craft exists. Imagine how much you could learn, and how much you could teach other people. It would be like giving me a year off and $100,000 to write the next great American novel, or asking a chemist to play around until they create a drug that cures cancer. Maybe I don't achieve my goal. Maybe the chemist doesn't have a breakthrough. But maybe we have the freedom to experiment, and our experiments are the basis from which the next writer or the next chemist or the next engineer works. Without GM, Chaparral may have won some more races, sure. But would it have changed the world? Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Next up, we're kicking off a 2-part series, digging into the explosive war between the Fédération Internationale du Sport Automobile and the Formula One Constructors Association that nearly killed Formula One and transformed the sport into the big money monolith we know it to be today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, don't forget to check out the DPTJ Substack, where I've been digging into contemporary motorsport news, breaking down the barriers to becoming a racing journalist, and keeping you up to date on everything you should be reading this week. Finally, if you have further questions, sponsorship opportunities, or you just want to reach out and say hi, I have an email for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I want to give a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can also find the full list in the description. My 2 biggest references this week were 2 books you heard me mention all throughout the episode, Unsafe at Any Speed by Ralph Nader and Texas Legend by George Levy. The first is a great piece of automotive history for anyone interested, but the latter is an absolute masterclass of writing, fact-checking, and storytelling. I recommend them both. That's all from me. I'll see you next time for the next episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys.